The wind was dry that morning on Okinawa, carrying the ash of a land broken by too many bombs. Along the scorched footpath leading from the hillside, a line of women moved slowly. Heads bowed, steps small, sandals broken, some barefoot. They did not speak. The earth beneath them had once held rice fields, bamboo groves, voices of children. Now it held craters, spent shells, and the ghosts of too many. They were nurses, clerks, cooks, not soldiers, not killers, yet dressed in the faded khaki of the Imperial Army. Their faces were hollow with hunger and dust, their hands trembling not from weakness, but from the memory of what they'd been told. That Americans did not take prisoners, that shame was worse than death, that capture meant defilement, humiliation, maybe worse. Each woman clutched a small bundle to her chest, tied in cloth, hidden beneath sleeves, or folded inside the waistbands of their uniforms. Not weapons, not contraband. Photographs. They were pictures of husbands in uniform, children laughing in kimonos, aging parents standing before wooden homes now likely turned to ash. One woman, Haruka, carried a small photo pressed between her palms like a prayer tablet. Her son, age 5, smiling as he held a tin toy plane. She had not seen him in 2 years. The photo was creased, stained with sweat, but it was all she had of him. As they reached the American checkpoint, guarded by 2 Marines in olive drab, the line halted. A translator stood waiting beside a table, his uniform clean, his hands folded. The order came, lay down everything. There was no resistance. The women, already defeated in spirit, obeyed. One by one, they placed what little they had onto the table. Knives for cooking, bundles of thread, canteens, and those small cloth parcels, the photographs. A hush swept through the line as one of the Americans picked up a folded image and stared. The woman from whom it came, a nurse named Keiko, began to shake. She gripped her skirt with both hands, eyes filling with tears. It had been her last act of courage to keep the photo hidden. Her daughter, 6 months old when she left, wrapped in a blanket she'd sewn herself. In that moment, she was sure it would be torn, thrown away, mocked. But the Marine said nothing. He glanced at the translator, then slowly handed it back to her. "You can keep it," the interpreter said softly, in clipped but careful Japanese. Keiko stared at the photo in her hands, disbelieving. The others saw this. Their silence deepened. Another woman, Ayako, watched as her photograph, her fiancé in naval dress, the only memory she had of him alive, was examined, then returned, even placed in a clean, white envelope. She bit her lip to keep from sobbing. There had been so many stories. Americans ate their prisoners, defiled the women, mocked them as animals. Some had even prepared for suicide. One had carried poison in her sleeve, only to throw it away after the Americans offered her a drink of water. This moment, the return of a photograph, was nothing in the grand scheme of the war. But for these women, it shattered something old inside them, because it wasn't about the paper. It was about what the Americans didn't do. They didn't take the memories. They didn't destroy the faces. They didn't strip away what little dignity remained. They saw the humanity first. The Marines didn't smile. They didn't try to comfort. But they didn't threaten either. Their silence held weight, not coldness, but restraint. A kind of decency passed between strangers who no longer saw uniforms, but simply faces. And so the march to the camp continued, but slower now, quieter still, because the women carried something heavier than fear. They carried doubt, and in that doubt, something like a crack had opened in the stone wall of hatred they'd been taught, just wide enough for a single ray of morning light. Haruka walked with her photo pressed to her chest, her steps unsteady. Around her, Others began to whisper, cautiously. No one dared speak too loud. But the looks were different now. Less like prisoners awaiting judgment, more like survivors, uncertain of what mercy might look like when it came not from gods, but from men. The barbed wire fencing of the temporary camp rose into view. Gray tents flapped gently in the wind. Smoke curled from mess fires. Somewhere in the distance, a harmonica played. Off-key, clumsy, unmistakably American. The women entered the gate. None of them smiled. But for the first time since capture, a few of them breathed. The wire closed behind them with a faint rattle, not the crash of a prison door, but still final enough. The women stepped past the threshold of the American camp, like ghosts unsure if they had crossed into life or death. Ahead stood rows of canvas tents, their edges weighted with stones. Pale smoke drifted from open-field kitchens. The air smelled of grease, dust, and something unfamiliar. Soap. A young corporal waved them forward. He didn't shout. He didn't leer. He just pointed toward a row of tables set under a makeshift tarp where other Marines waited, clipboards in hand. The processing began. Each woman gave her name, one by one, eyes downcast. Some trembled as they spoke, afraid to say the wrong word, afraid their accent might bring punishment. The Americans asked no questions about their service. No interrogation, no scolding. Only names, ranks, and whether they had wounds or illnesses. Then came the part that frightened them most. Possessions? The translator asked with polite neutrality. Not as an order, almost like a question in a classroom. But still, the moment struck hard. A middle-aged woman named Saki stepped forward. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped her bundle, just a tin comb, a bamboo needle case, and one photograph. Her husband in uniform, standing before a cherry blossom tree, 2 sons beside him. The younger had died of malaria the year before she'd left the village. The Marine behind the table didn't touch it. He gestured for her to keep it. Saki paused, eyes wide. "No take?" she asked, broken English, barely a whisper. The interpreter responded gently, "Not if it's your family." Saki stared down at the photograph. Then, silently, her knees buckled. She didn't fall fully, just dropped to a crouch, hand covering her mouth. No sob, no scream, just the sudden, overwhelming weight of a fear that didn't come true. The photo hadn't been taken. In a war that had taken everything else, home, safety, language, even control over one's own body, this small act of return hit like a cannon blast to the soul. Other women saw this. They stopped hiding their photos. Some who had wrapped theirs in undergarments or sewn them into jacket linings began to loosen threads, unbutton pouches. One woman removed her shoe and gently withdrew a folded paper from beneath the insole. Another unwrapped a kerchief tied around her thigh. Each time, the Americans did the same thing. They nodded. They stepped back. They handed over small paper envelopes to protect the fading images from the sun. It was not expected. It was not doctrine. It was something even stronger, instinct. And the women began to feel it. Not the comfort of safety yet, but the shock of being seen. Inside the tent assigned to them, they sat in rows, not talking. A Red Cross nurse moved among them with a basin of warm water. She offered no chatter, just towels, gentle movements, and a steady, maternal silence. Ayako watched her hands as she wrung out the cloth. Clean, older hands. A ring on her left finger. Her eyes didn't linger on their uniforms or their faces. She simply worked. When the nurse reached Ayako, she paused. Ayako flinched, then realized the woman was pointing gently at the photograph Ayako held in her lap. "Your family?" the nurse asked. Ayako hesitated, then nodded. The nurse bent slightly, just enough to look closer. "He looks like a strong boy." The boy in the photo was Ayako's younger brother, 16, conscripted into the Imperial Navy, just months before Okinawa fell. She hadn't spoken his name aloud since the surrender. "Kenji," she whispered. The nurse smiled. Not with pity, but with something quieter. A kind of shared understanding that mothers and sisters carry across all borders. She moved on without another word, and Ayako stared after her, heart pounding. Around the room, other women began to hold their photos differently. Not hidden in laps or folded between knees, but out in the open, resting in palms, laid gently beside them. A few even began to speak names aloud. One murmured a husband's name through tears. Another spoke of her mother's hair, her smile. None of them had done this for months. Their world had been stripped down to commands, explosions, and silence. Now, here in this strange tent, beneath American canvas, memory returned. The memory of before, of who they had been before war demanded they forget. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest kindness of all. Because with memory came grief. To remember was to feel. To feel was to weep. One woman, older than the rest, finally broke the silence. She began to sing, softly, shakily, a lullaby from her childhood village. The kind sung to babies as they drifted to sleep under paper lanterns and straw roofs. The song rose like a prayer into the evening air, echoing through the tent walls like wind through pine. And no one stopped her. The Americans, standing just outside the flap, did not enter, did not interrupt. They listened, and inside, the women did not sleep that night. Not yet. But they lay still beside the photographs of the people they once loved and whispered their names into the dark. The night stretched long across the Okinawan hills. Outside the camp fence, the sky was bruised with smoke and stars. American sentries walked their rounds slowly, boots crunching on gravel, rifles slung loosely over shoulders. Beyond them, the faint sound of waves rolled against the shattered coastline where the last fires of war still burned. Inside the women's tent, silence lay heavy, a silence of exhaustion, not rest. The air smelled of sweat, canvas, and faint soap. Some of the women had bathed for the first time in weeks. Others couldn't bring themselves to. Fear had not left them. It merely crouched quietly in the corners. Haruka lay awake, staring at the photograph in her hands. Her son's smile, blurred by creases, looked impossibly bright in the flickering lamplight. Around her, shapes shifted in the half-dark, other women turning, whispering in sleep, clutching their own small memories to their chests. From somewhere outside came the faint strum of a guitar, hesitant, uncertain, like someone learning the chords by moonlight. It was not a tune she recognized, but the rhythm, slow, human, imperfect, reminded her of home in ways she could not explain. Haruka had been told the Americans were monsters, that they burned villages, desecrated the dead, mocked the emperor. Yet here, behind wire and armed guards, she found something far more dangerous. Gentleness. It frightened her more than any weapon. At dawn, a new sound came. Metal bowls clattering, the soft chatter of English voices. The women were led to the mess area, where long wooden tables stood under the open sky. American cooks ladled porridge and bread, powdered milk, a single slice of canned fruit. They watched closely, waiting for mockery, orders, or punishment. None came. The guards moved aside. "Eat," the interpreter said. One by one, they sat, stiff-backed and silent. Some bowed their heads as if to pray. Others only stared at the steam rising from their cups. Haruka picked up her spoon. The porridge was bland, strange, faintly sweet. Her hands shook so hard she almost spilled it. Then she noticed one of the Marines, tall, young, his sleeves rolled up, watching her with an expression that wasn't scorn, but something else entirely. curiosity. When their eyes met, he looked away first. Moments later, she realized he had left something on the edge of her table. A small paper envelope. She hesitated, glanced to see if it was a mistake, then opened it. Inside was her photograph. The same one she'd been forced to surrender at the gate the day before. But now it was pressed flat, the corners neatly smoothed, and enclosed in a transparent sleeve cut from a map case. She covered her mouth with both hands. Tears came without warning. The Marine didn't return. He walked off to the next table, saying nothing, head lowered against the wind. Ayako, seated beside her, saw the trembling paper and whispered, "He fixed it." Haruka nodded, unable to speak. The photograph had survived the battle. And somehow, so had she. Later that afternoon, the women were gathered near the edge of the camp, where a makeshift line of laundry flapped in the wind. Red Cross nurses distributed brushes and soap. The women washed their clothing, their hair, even the dust from their shoes. One of the nurses, a woman with gray streaks in her hair, approached and motioned gently for Haruka's photograph. Haruka froze, gripping it tighter. The nurse smiled softly, held up a small square of wax paper, and gestured again. This time, Haruka understood. The nurse wasn't taking it. She was offering to protect it. She slipped the photograph into the wax paper, folded the edge, and handed it back as if returning a sacred relic. "Keep it dry," the nurse said in slow, careful English. Haruka bowed her head, whispering words she didn't know the English for. Thank you, maybe, or mercy. That night, the wind carried the smell of rain. The tents flickered with dim yellow light. Some women wrote their names in the dirt, practicing the characters they feared might vanish if they didn't keep them alive. Others, for the first time, sat together and spoke quietly. About families, schools, the mountains back home. No one spoke of the emperor anymore. The idea of him felt distant, like a statue buried under too much rubble. In his place came something smaller, but real, the warmth of another's hands, the rough grain of wood, the sound of laughter from the American kitchen as someone burned the evening rations. Haruka lay awake again, staring at her photograph, listening to the faint rhythm of boots outside. She did not think of surrender or shame or even of home. She thought of the Marine who had repaired her son's smile, a man whose name she did not know, who might never remember her face. But in that small act, something had been given back to her that the war had taken. It was not victory. It was not forgiveness. It was the fragile rediscovery of being seen as human. The rain came softly after midnight, tapping on canvas, washing the air clean. The camp slept, and for the first time, Haruka dreamed. Not of explosions or screams, but of a boy with a toy airplane, waving from the threshold of a doorway filled with morning light. By the third day, the women no longer walked with eyes glued to the ground. Their steps remained cautious, but they no longer seemed to fear the air itself. Small things began to change. One woman braided her hair, another dusted her sleeves with her palms. These were not acts of defiance nor pride. They were rituals of return to themselves. In the far corner of the camp, just beyond the medical tent, stood a wooden shack the Americans had converted into a record-keeping station. A single typewriter clicked rhythmically inside, its keys pressed by a corporal with square glasses and a patient face. The women were brought there one by one for formal registration. Names, birthplaces, family status. Haruka entered hesitantly, holding her photograph in both hands. The corporal looked up, adjusted his glasses, and offered a small nod. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "Name?" the interpreter asked in Japanese. "Yamada Haruka." "Place of birth?" "Fukushima." The corporal typed slowly, carefully, making sure each kanji character was spelled phonetically beside its romanized form. Then, unexpectedly, he reached beneath the table and pulled out a thin card with Japanese writing on one side. Her name, translated with respectful accuracy. ID card, the interpreter explained. To carry. Haruka took it with both hands and bowed instinctively. It was not just a document. It was proof that someone, even an enemy, believed her name was worth preserving. Outside the shack, Ayako waited. She held her brother's photo close, her fingers stained with dust and ink from her own paperwork. As Haruka emerged, they exchanged a glance. Then, for the first time, a faint smile. A week earlier, they had both been prepared to die. Now they were beginning, tentatively, to live. At mealtime, the women no longer huddled tightly in silence. They began to sit in familiar groups, nurses with nurses, clerks with clerks, some even saving seats for others, marking spots with folded blankets or small stones. One morning, a new routine began. A Red Cross nurse handed out writing paper and stubby pencils. She said nothing, only pointed gently to the boxes. Mail. It took time to understand. Mail? Home? The interpreter explained. If they wrote letters, the camp officers would try to deliver them. No promises, but they would try. At first, the women stared blankly. Letters were a thing from another life, a civilian life, a pre-war life. Who would still be there to read them? Then one of the younger women, barely 19, sat down and began to write. Mother, she wrote in kanji, her pencil trembling, I am alive. The others followed. Some wrote to children they had left behind, not knowing if they still lived. Some wrote to husbands, unsure whether those men were now ashes scattered across distant islands. A few wrote to neighbors, asking if the village still stood. Each letter began not with complaints or shame, but with breathless confession. I thought I would die, but I didn't. I am being treated kindly. I don't understand it. By dusk, a small wooden box beside the mess hall had filled with folded letters. That night, Haruka sat with Ayako under the lantern strung outside the medical tent. The light buzzed softly, attracting moths that danced like falling ashes. Haruka unfolded her photo again. Her son, always smiling, always 5 years old. She whispered to Ayako, Do you think he would recognize me now? Ayako looked down. Her brother had been 16, likely gone like so many young men. He would know your eyes, she said softly. They sat in silence. The war was still not over. Not truly. The world beyond the wire might never forgive them, and they did not yet know what they would return to, or if return was even possible. But inside the camp, the Americans were no longer faceless monsters. They had names, routines. One Marine limped from an old shrapnel wound. Another always carried a harmonica, playing the same tune each evening, never quite in tune, but always gently. The women began to notice these details. They noticed how the cooks whistled when stirring pots. They noticed how the guards looked away respectfully when they passed the latrines. They noticed that the nurses tied their hair up the same way their own mothers once did. The enemy, it turned out, had a name, and that realization did not come with triumph or collapse. It came with quiet ache. The ache of things that might have been different if war had not come. Before sleep, Haruka tucked her photo inside a small cloth pouch made from the sleeve of her old uniform. She tied it gently with a thread pulled from her blanket. It was not much, but it was hers. It was memory, carried through fire. And now, because of someone unexpected, it had survived. Morning came quietly. The air in the camp was heavier than usual, a soft mist rising from the nearby hills, curling around tent posts and boots and the metal of canteens. It was laundry day. A new routine now. Wash basin, scrubbing, soap, drawing lines that snapped gently in the wind like flags of a nation that no longer existed. The women worked slowly, side by side, their sleeves rolled to the elbows, their knuckles red from cold water. No one ordered them to do this. No American shouted. It had simply become a rhythm: clean clothes, clean hands, warm food, silence, then light. Haruka stood ankle-deep in mud at the edge of the line, her hands wringing out her worn uniform top. Her photograph remained inside the cloth pouch tied to her belt, protected from water and wind. She would not leave it in the tent. Not anymore. Beside her, Ayako hummed. Not a tune of defiance, not even memory, just sound, instinctive, human. Something to fill the space between grief and survival. That morning, a new officer arrived in camp. He was not tall, nor loud, but his uniform was clean and pressed, his eyes sharp, his voice low. A major, judging by the insignia on his collar. He did not glare or bark orders. Instead, he stood near the gate, reading the women's names from a clipboard. But he did something none of the others had. He tried to pronounce them. Yamada Haruka, he said slowly, syllable by syllable. The name sounded strange in his mouth, rough, misaligned, but not mocking. He was trying. Haruka turned, startled. The others froze. They had not heard their names spoken aloud by an American before. Not like this. Not as people. Haruka stepped forward. The major looked up from the clipboard. His eyes met hers, not soft, not unkind, just steady. He gave the faintest nod, then handed her a folded card. "You've been approved for relocation," the interpreter explained. "Saipan, a longer-term facility, safer, better conditions. War is almost over." Haruka blinked, her mouth opened slightly. She bowed, then bowed again, more deeply. The card had her name, her full name, spelled in Roman letters. Below it, the words, "Non-combatant POW, civilian auxiliary." She held the card like scripture. The next name was read aloud. Takahashi Ayako. Ayako stepped forward, trembling. When the major handed her the same folded card, she whispered something in Japanese. Just 2 words. "Thank you." The interpreter didn't translate it. He didn't need to. That afternoon, the women gathered in the tent to pack what little they had. They would leave the next morning. American trucks would take them to a port, then a ship to Saipan, a place none of them had seen, but which now meant one thing. They were not forgotten. Haruka sat cross-legged on her blanket, folding the photograph carefully into a new wax sleeve given to her by one of the nurses. Around her, quiet voices spoke of families, of food, of what they hoped to find. Not grand dreams, just small things. Books, a letter, the sound of ocean wind without bombs in it. As dusk fell, the women were invited, not ordered, to gather near the mess area. A small field had been cleared. Lanterns hung from makeshift poles. A gramophone played a scratchy tune, American, old, slow. The kind of music that came from another continent, one they had feared and hated and now could barely imagine. The American guard stood off to the side. No rifles in hand, no helmets, just men watching quietly. And then something happened that would remain with them forever. One of the Marines, the same one who had handed Haruka her repaired photograph days earlier, stepped forward holding a notebook. He approached slowly, respectfully, and without theatrics. He had written down, in careful handwriting, the women's names. He began reading them aloud. Yamada Haruka, Takahashi Ayako, Sato Keiko. One by one, the names floated into the lantern-lit air. Not as numbers, not as prisoners, but as people. The Americans had not only allowed them to keep their photographs, they had given them something even rarer. They had spoken their names kindly. That night, as the women returned to their tents, they walked differently. not with pride, but with something like memory. Not of who they had been under the flag of war, but of who they might be after. Ayako whispered as she lay down. My name sounded strange, but he said it like it mattered. Haruka didn't respond. She held her photograph close to her chest and closed her eyes. Outside, a breeze moved through the camp, lifting the corners of blankets, rattling the lanterns faintly. And somewhere near the gate, the American guard picked up his harmonica and played again. This time the tune didn't sound off. It sounded like something new, something beginning. At dawn, the trucks arrived. Big, wide-nosed vehicles with wooden benches in the back and canvas stretched overhead. They rumbled into the compound with a low, deliberate thunder that stirred both dust and emotion. But the women did not flinch. Not like before. There were no chains, no shouting. Just a quiet roll call, the interpreter's voice calm, even warm. He read each name slowly, pausing between them, giving the women time to gather their things. They had little to carry. A small pack of folded clothes, a bar of soap, a military-issue blanket. But in every bundle, there was something else. Something hidden, wrapped like treasure. The photographs. Haruka's was tucked into the inner lining of her jacket now, sewn in with a single line of careful stitches. She had done it the night before with a needle borrowed from a Red Cross nurse and thread from her own shirt cuff. She had stitched it in silence, her hands steady, her eyes wet, not because she feared losing it, but because she needed it close, closer than breath. Ayako carried hers in the pocket of her skirt, wrapped in a square of old cotton cloth that smelled faintly of pine. She had written her brother's name on the edge in pencil, as if afraid the ink of memory might one day fade. As they climbed into the trucks, one by one, they looked back only once. Not to mourn, but to remember. The American guard stood at attention, not saluting, not smiling, just watching, respectfully. Some held their caps against their chests. One, the harmonica player, raised a hand in a small farewell. Not a wave, just a gesture, like a man bidding goodbye to someone who had survived something unspeakable. The road to the port was long and winding, carved through cliffs that still bore the scars of shell fire. They passed burned-out tanks, craters filled with rainwater, and small stone shrines half buried in mud. The island was quiet now, but the silence carried memory like smoke. No one spoke on the truck, but they held tight to the photos in their hands, sleeves, linings. The tiny pieces of peace they had been allowed to keep. At the docks, the sea stretched wide and gray. A transport ship waited, its hull streaked with rust, its American flag hanging limp in the morning stillness. The gangway rattled in the breeze. One by one, the women disembarked the trucks and stepped onto the gangway. Each step felt strange. The war had taught them that movement came with risk, that every crossing led deeper into danger. But this one felt different. There was no shouting, no dogs, no rifles aimed at their backs. Instead, U.S. Navy personnel stood by with clipboards and coffee. Coffee? A nurse held out a tin mug to Ayako. She hesitated, then took it with both hands. The steam curled up into her face, mixing with the smell of salt and iron and diesel fuel. She sipped. It was bitter and sweet and tasted like something she didn't have a word for. Haruka stood beside her, looking out at the sea. Somewhere beyond that line of gray water lay Saipan, a new camp, perhaps still fenced, still guarded. But after this place, after the small mercies and the names spoken aloud, it no longer felt like exile. It felt like passage. When they were all aboard, the ship's engines groaned to life. The island of Okinawa began to drift slowly away. On the deck, the women stood together, wind in their hair, salt on their lips. Some gripped the railing with white knuckles. Others simply stared. They were not smiling. but they were no longer shrinking. The photographs, tucked close, warmed against their skin. That night, as the ship rolled gently beneath the stars, they were given cots and wool blankets. The Red Cross distributed paper and pencils again, a new opportunity to write home. Haruka sat beneath a low light and wrote on her knees, "To my sister, I am being moved to a new island. The Americans do not treat us cruelly. They gave me food. They gave me soap. They returned my photograph of Kaito. I thought I would die. Instead, I remember how to be alive." She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her pack beside the thread and needle. Ayako didn't write. She sat on the edge of her cot, listening to the ocean. Her hands cradled her photo like a bird's egg, fragile, precious, unbroken. The ship continued forward through the dark, its lights dimmed against the horizon. Below deck, the women finally slept, not like prisoners, but like people who had survived the collapse of one world and were drifting slowly, impossibly, toward another. When the sun rose over Saipan, it cast long streaks of gold across the harbor water, gilding the edges of barbed wire and palm trees in the same soft light. The ship groaned as it docked, and the women stirred beneath wool blankets, blinking at the scent of land, diesel, and hibiscus in bloom. Haruka sat up slowly, her fingers immediately checking the inside seam of her jacket. The stitch was still there, her son's photograph still tucked close to her heart. She exhaled. The American guards gave the same instructions as before, only quieter now. Not because they feared rebellion, but because something between them had changed. No one barked. No boots stomped. The war had emptied so many voices. What remained were gestures, brief nods, and the silent language of human routine. The women disembarked in pairs, escorted to a flatbed truck that waited on the sun-bleached dock. A Red Cross banner flapped limply beside a wooden welcome sign scrawled in chalk, "Temporary civilian internment, Saipan." They were prisoners. That truth had not changed, but the sentence no longer sounded like a death knell. Here, under the swaying palms and the distant hum of a U.S. radio broadcast playing Glenn Miller, the word prisoner had begun to soften, not in meaning, but in weight. The new camp was cleaner. Tents had wooden floors, the latrines were private, and the nurses, always the nurses, offered familiar faces from Okinawa, now dressed in white blouses instead of khaki fatigues. Some even had pins with red enamel crosses. There were rules: daily roll call, curfew, assigned duties. But there were also freedoms: walking without guards inside the compound, tending a small garden patch if one wished, reading, if you could, from a small shelf of donated books in Japanese and English. One day, a new surprise: a mirror. It was small, cracked, barely larger than a soup bowl, and nailed to the support post beside the women's washing station. Haruka stood before it for a long time. The face that stared back was thinner than she remembered. Lines carved by sun and hunger etched her cheeks. But her eyes, still hers, still alive. Ayako stood beside her and laughed softly. "You look older." Haruka smiled faintly. "So do you." They didn't cry. Not for that. Aging was proof they had survived. Later that week, the Americans offered sewing kits. Not uniforms or medals, just needles, thread, fabric scraps. A Red Cross volunteer pantomimed, "Make something for yourself." For many of the women, it was the first act of creation after years of destruction. Haruka took a square of faded floral cloth and stitched a pouch. It wasn't beautiful. The edges were uneven, but it fit her photograph perfectly. She added a small button, one she'd saved from her imperial uniform, and wrapped the whole thing in a folded handkerchief. It was hers, made with her hands, and safe. The days in Saipan passed not quickly, but gently. The Americans hosted hygiene lessons, nutrition talks, even music hours. Sometimes a chaplain would read aloud in slow, clear Japanese, parables and psalms, not to convert, but to comfort. Even if belief didn't survive the war, stories still could. One evening, a group of American nurses invited the Japanese women to a gathering. Nothing formal, just tea and sweet rolls made with flour and pineapple jam. At first, the women hesitated. Tea without ceremony felt strange. Laughter among enemies felt dangerous. But curiosity overcame fear. Haruka sat beside Ayako, both holding their tin cups, legs folded neatly beneath them. The Red Cross nurse from Okinawa, the one who had returned so many photographs, stood up and lifted her mug. "We do not know your pain," she said through the interpreter, "but we see that you carry it." She raised her cup to the mothers who wait and the daughters who remember. There was no applause, just the clink of metal against metal, and the long silence of women across two nations seeing each other not as warnings, but as mirrors. That night, Haruka placed her photograph beside her cot, resting it atop the floral pouch. She no longer hid it, not because the danger was gone, but because the shame had lifted. In the dark, she whispered her son's name again, Kaido. Ayako, in the next cot, whispered hers, Kenji. No reply came, no miracle voice from the other side of war. But the saying of names had returned, no longer as prayer or apology, but as remembrance. They had not been erased, and neither had the ones they loved. Outside the tent, the wind rustled through palm fronds. Somewhere across the compound, an American nurse laughed quietly at something in a letter from home. The stars above Saipan watched without judgment. Saipan was not home, but it wasn't hell. It was something in between, a place where humanity survived in the ashes. And here, they carried forward what they thought war had destroyed. By late summer, the light in Saipan had changed. It no longer struck harshly through the clouds like shrapnel. It softened, lengthened, warmed. The women began to leave their tents in the early morning, not from obligation, but choice. The cool wind, laced with the scent of salt and ash trees, became a daily ritual. They walked the perimeter path of the camp in small pairs, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, but no longer in fear. There was a bulletin board now, hammered into place by American engineers using scrap wood from abandoned supply crates. It held announcements, laundry rotations, meal schedules, news of the war's closing chapters. But it also held something else. A photograph, taped gently in the center, was a black and white image of a young Japanese woman holding a small boy. The caption, written in both English and Japanese, read simply, "We found this among Allied post-surrender documents. If she is yours, please come forward." Haruka stared at it for a long time. Not because it was hers, it wasn't, but because it could have been. The way the woman's hand cradled the boy's head, the way the child looked out at the lens with no knowledge of war, it stirred something old and rooted in her. Later that day, one of the women did come forward, a seamstress named Naomi. She said nothing at first, just stood in front of the board for nearly half an hour before placing her hand on the photo and quietly asking, "May I have it?" The American officer nodded. No questions, no conditions. Naomi held the photo to her chest like it was warm bread. She did not cry. She simply walked away, her eyes brighter than they'd been since Okinawa. That moment changed something. The next day, a second woman, Midori, who had barely spoken since her capture, approached the bulletin board with her own photograph in hand. She taped it beside the first, her son, age 8, wearing a straw hat and squinting into the sun. Below it, she wrote, "If anyone knows where he is, please tell me. I will wait." And that was the beginning. By week's end, the board was filled. Dozens of photographs, some wrinkled, some torn, some carefully preserved, lined the makeshift wall like prayers made of paper and hope. Mothers, brothers, daughters, entire families now reduced to inches of faded film and memory. They were no longer hidden in coat linings or mattress seams. They were offered up, shared, and the Americans didn't stop them. In fact, they started adding their own. One Marine taped up a photograph of his wife and infant daughter in Kansas. Underneath, he wrote, "Born 6 months before I shipped out. She's crawling now, they say." A nurse added a wedding photo. A chaplain, a picture of his 2 brothers in uniform. One missing in Europe. It was no longer a bulletin board. It was a wall of memory, of people, of proof that both sides had more in common than they'd ever been allowed to believe. One afternoon, Haruka approached the board with Ayako. In her hand, she held her son's photograph. Newly smoothed, placed in the pouch she'd sewn with thread from a Red Cross parcel. Her fingers hovered near the corner of the board. She hesitated. Ayako looked at her and said, "It's not hiding anymore. It's remembering." So Haruka pinned it up. No name, no explanation. Just the photo of a 5-year-old boy with a tin toy airplane and a grin wide enough to survive even war. That evening, she returned after dinner to find something taped beneath it. A note. In careful katakana, it read, "I had a son too. He died on Peleliu. But your boy, he looks like him. Thank you for reminding me of his face." Haruka didn't know who had written it. American? Japanese? She didn't ask. She only folded the note and placed it inside her pouch, alongside the photo. Some days, women stood at the board for hours. They didn't speak much, but they touched the corners of each image as if brushing the cheeks of the people inside. There were no arguments, no propaganda, no speeches, just photographs, standing quietly against the wind, bearing witness to the lives war could not erase. It became sacred in its own way, a chapel of memory without altar or incense. Just the truth that even enemies could grieve, and in that grief, recognize each other. Ayako said it one night, softly, as the lanterns flickered and the ocean wind blew through the canvas flaps. "They took our weapons, but they gave us back our dead." Haruka nodded, because in the end, war is not undone by force. It is undone by faces, by names spoken with care, by photographs not confiscated, but carried. And now, for the first time, they were not the only ones carrying. Autumn reached Saipan gently. There were no red leaves, no frosted winds, no familiar smells of tatami or chestnut rice. But the light shifted, just slightly. The mornings came slower, with more mist hanging above the wire. And in the evenings, the stars shone clearer, as if war had stepped back, just far enough to let the sky be noticed again. The camp was quieter now. Some women had already been sent home, those too ill or too old, or simply too broken to stay longer. Others waited patiently, lists in their hands, names of relatives they hoped had survived the fire bombings. Each day brought new rumors. Japan had surrendered, the emperor had spoken, American ships would begin repatriation soon. Still, no one packed. They had learned by now that war could take its time ending. Even when the shooting stopped, the disbelief lingered like dust in an old room. One morning, Haruka rose before the others and walked alone to the bulletin board. The photos were still there, dozens of them, fluttering gently in the morning breeze like silent flags of memory. Her son's picture, though slightly sun-faded, still smiled through the grain of the paper, and beneath it, a second note, this one written in soft pencil, the characters awkward but legible. I don't know his name, but I've seen that smile before. In Tokyo, 1939. My unit helped build schools there. Maybe he was one of the boys playing on the roof with paper kites. Haruka stared at the words for a long time. They meant nothing, and yet they meant everything, because someone, somewhere, had remembered her son not as an enemy's child, not as a face in a war, but as a child, a boy with a kite. that small echo of a past they both once shared before nations told them to hate, was mercy in written form, not pity, not forgiveness, just mercy. Later that week, word finally came. A Navy lieutenant arrived with a folded paper in his hand and gathered the women in the central tent. The message was brief. You will be repatriated within the month. A transport ship is coming. The war is over. No cheers, no shouts, just the sound of breathing, long held, finally let go. Some wept silently. Others stared blankly, unsure what home meant anymore. Because what do you return to when the house is gone? When the people in your photos may be only names now? When you've seen your enemies treat your memories more gently than your own commanders ever did? Ayako sat beside Haruka that evening, holding her brother's photo between her palms. Do you think he'll be there? She asked. Haruka didn't answer. Not because she didn't care, but because she'd learned not to promise hope too easily. Instead, she reached over and gently touched Ayako's shoulder. Even if he's not, she said, you are. That night, the women sat in a circle by lantern light and began writing again. Letters, final ones, for those they hoped to find. Some even wrote to the Americans. One woman folded her note into the pouch that had once held soap and said, "For the nurse who gave me back my mother's picture. If you find this, please know, I will not forget." Haruka wrote only one sentence. "Thank you for letting me keep my son." No return address, no plea, just that. And she folded the letter beside the photograph. Not to give away, but to carry. Again. Always. The next morning, the bulletin board was taken down. The Americans said they would pack the photos carefully, preserve them, return any that could be traced. But some women asked to take theirs back, and so they did. They removed them gently, one by one, pressing corners flat, wrapping them in cloth like sacred things. Not because they needed them to prove anything, but because these scraps of paper had survived what so many people had not, and surviving made them holy. When the trucks came to take them to the port, the same port they had once arrived at as shadows, the women climbed aboard as women again. Not soldiers, not prisoners, just women. Mothers, sisters, daughters, carriers of memory. The American guards saluted them, not with flourish, not with ceremony. Just a hand raised, a nod, and in return, Haruka bowed, deeply, slowly, with all the weight of someone who had once expected to die faceless, and was instead allowed to be remembered. As the trucks pulled away, the dust lifted into the air and hung there, like ash, like incense, like prayers not quite spoken aloud. And on Haruka's lap, beneath folded hands, the photograph lay warm from the sun. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. She had seen her son's face in the faces of others now, in strangers who returned what they could have taken, and what they gave her was not victory, not apology, but the quiet, enduring mercy of being allowed to remember. The ship back to Japan cut across a sea that had once been marked with blood and wreckage. Now, it was still, not calm, but exhausted, like the sky had cried itself out and left only reflection behind. The women stood along the railing in silence, faces turned toward the fading outline of Saipan, wind brushing strands of hair that had gone gray too soon. There was no singing, no ceremony, only a final look at the place that had strangely restored their humanity. Haruka held her son's photograph in her lap, folded within the stitched cloth she had kept close through each camp, each checkpoint, each sleepless night. She did not unwrap it. She didn't need to. Ayako stood beside her, one hand resting over her heart, the other inside her coat, where her brother's picture lay. Somewhere down below, American sailors worked the engines, shouted to each other, played music from a small radio crackling with static and swing. The worlds remained divided. Language, flag, memory. And yet, there was no more hatred. just distance and understanding. When the ship reached the harbor at Yokosuka, what greeted them was not jubilation. It was silence. The docks were broken in places. The cranes leaned like old men. A few scattered Japanese officials waited, wearing faded uniforms and expressions too hollow to be called joy. They did not shout. They did not embrace. They simply motioned the women forward. As Haruka stepped onto land, her knees buckled, not from weakness, but weight. The weight of war, the weight of return, the unbearable absence of all that should have been there waiting. No child came running. No husband stood watching. No voice called her name. Ayako gripped her elbow and steadied her. Around them, the women moved like ghosts, returning to a home they no longer recognized. Japan was there, yes. The soil, the smell of pine and coal smoke. But it was not the same. Cities were gone. Towns burned. The emperor had spoken on the radio, but even his voice sounded smaller now. Weeks passed. Haruka traveled north by train, through broken stations and fields once green with rice, but now empty. In her village, she found rubble where her home once stood. Her neighbor told her that her husband had died in the final raids. Her son, Kaito, had been seen playing in the yard just hours before the fire fell from the sky. No one had found his body. Only the toy airplane, melted and bent, still rested in the dirt where the veranda had been. Haruka stood in that ash with the photograph in her hands. She did not cry. Instead, she knelt, slowly, reverently, and placed the picture into the soil, wrapping it in a scrap of the cloth pouch she'd sewn on Saipan. She pressed it beneath the blackened earth, beside a piece of charred wood, and whispered her son's name one last time, not to summon him, but to release him. Then she stood and walked away. Not as a soldier, not as a prisoner, not even as a mother, but as a witness. Because that was what mercy had left her, the right to carry memory without shame, to speak names without fear, to bury grief without being buried by it. She never saw the American nurse again, or the Marine with the harmonica. But their acts remained, not as faces, but as echoes. The envelope, the mirror, the envelope, the bulletin board, the notes left beneath photographs. Haruka lived quietly after the war. She never remarried. She opened a small tea house in a nearby town, where people gathered not to talk about war, but to sit quietly with the living. In the back room, beneath a drawer, she kept a box. Inside, a folded square of cloth, frayed at the edges. No photograph remained, just a pressed white card that once read, Yamada, Haruka non-combatant, POWs, Saipan Chem, 1945. It was the only document she kept from the war, the one that proved her name had been spoken aloud and returned to her with care. Because in the end, that was what remained. Not the battles, not the flags, not the headlines, but the smallest things. A cup of water, a stitched pouch, a child's smile on sun-worn paper, a photograph once hidden in fear, now remembered in peace.